Good morning, everybody. Welcome to your 13th lecture, online lecture. Today we'll be discussing shock. Shock is a state of inadequate tissue perfusion. Tissue perfusion, please remember the terms oxygenation, tissue oxygenation, and tissue perfusion. The primary pathology is that there is a mismatch between the oxygen supply and the metabolic demand of the tissues. This results in cellular hypoxia. Cellular hypoxia then leads to anaerobic metabolism. There is accumulation of metabolic waste and which may then damage the different organs and lead to multi-organ failure. This simplistic diagram is to highlight the central pump and the peripheral circulation. The strength of the muscle contraction and the heart rate, are the mechanisms which affect on the heart. And then you have the peripheral resistance and the capillary bed, which affect the circulation, the peripheral part of the circulation. This we will discuss throughout the lecture. Inadequate tissue perfusion, cardiogenic or peripheral shock, is essentially hypovolemia or vasodilatation, and result is low venous return, which again compounds the inadequate tissue perfusion. Oxygen delivery of oxygen is cardiac output multiplied by the arterial oxygen saturation. And we know that cardiac output is heart rate multiplied by stroke volume. So heart rate, stroke volume, and the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial circulation. These three factors affect the delivery of oxygen to the tissues. Two main types of shock, central shock and peripheral shock. Central shock is primarily characterized by the reduced cardiac output. Peripheral shock is characterized by low peripheral resistance. The reduced cardiac output may be the return of reduced venous return or reduced stroke volume, and this is seen in hypovolemic, cardiogenic, and obstructive types of shock. Whereas in the peripheral type of shock, initially there is high venous return and high stroke volume, but in late stages, this is followed by reduced venous return and reduced stroke volume. Uh, the types of shock which are included in peripheral shock include anaphylactic shock, vasovagal, neurogenic, psychogenic, septic shock, traumatic shock, or Burns shock. All these we will discuss in detail. So some examples of the central shock where there is reduced cardiac output. First commonest example is hypovolemic shock, which may be the result of bleeding or dehydration. Then there is obstructive shock. The circulation is blocked or obstructed. This may be the result of a pulmonary embolism or air embolism, or the high pressure in the chest because of tension pneumothorax, or high pressure in the pericardium because of bleeding into the pericardium leading to cardiac tamponade. Then there is cardiogenic shock where the primary pathology is the cardiac pump failure. This can happen in myocardial infarction, in cardiomyopathy, in myocarditis, or secondary to certain drugs which depress the heart. The peripheral types of shocks include distributive shock and endocrine shock. Distributive shock is where the volume of fluid in the body remains the same. However, the fluids are redistributed within the body out of the intravascular compartment to the extracellular compartment, and this sudden shifting of the blood volume from inside the blood vessels to outside the blood vessels into the intercellular space is seen in anaphylactic shock, vasovagal, septic, neurogenic, psychogenic, traumatic, and burn shock. Uh, the primary pathology is low peripheral resistance. Uh, Either the volume is shifted out of the intravascular compartment, or suddenly the intravascular compartment dilates so much that there is not enough blood to fill the intravascular compartment with adequate blood pressure. This is distributive shock. Then in endocrine shock, Addison's crisis, and thyrotoxic storm, you also see low peripheral resistance, a state like dehydration. Shocks due to the low cardiac output or the central shock. Hypovolemic shock is generally hemorrhagic. The hemorrhage can be revealed or concealed, overt or occult, or it can be non-hemorrhagic because of severe dehydration, which may occur in severe burns, in severe vomiting, and diarrhea. Essentially, there is reduction in circulating volume, which leads to reduction in venous return and cardiac output. As a result, oxygen supply and demand imbalance takes place, anaerobic metabolism starts, and there is lactic acidosis. We discussed in the last lecture on hemorrhage, class 1, 2, 3, and 4 hemorrhage. Uh, Different types, class 1 and class 2, are the hemorrhages that are treatable. If you have allowed a patient to reach the class 3 stage, then the patient is at risk, because now the patient is in full-fledged shock, which is decompensated shock. Uh, Here, class 1 and 2, the patient may still have maintained his blood pressure. This you would call a compensated shock. But here the patient has decompensated, and if the patient loses more than 40% of the blood volume, then there is refractory hypotension, refractory acidosis, and ultimately death. So this class 4 hemorrhage would mean an irreversible shock. This is a decompensated but still reversible, and this would be a compensated shock. Hypotension is a sign of cardiovascular insufficiency. Normally, if one component malfunctions, the other compensates to return the blood pressure to normal. For example, cardiac output is stroke volume and heart rate. If the stroke volume falls, the heart rate goes up to compensate and maintain the cardiac output at homeostatic level. However, in shock, one element has malfunctioned and the others have failed to adequately compensate. That is why the cardiac output and the blood pressure have fallen. So, and the patient has gone in shock. Now, if we look at this is the percentage of blood loss, and this is the cardiac output. Up to 10% of the blood loss, the arterial blood pressure and the cardiac output are quite satisfactorily maintained, and this would be a compensated shock. However, here you see that cardiac output has already started decreasing, but the blood pressure is still maintained. This is the window where an astute house officer or a good doctor will identify that the patient is going to go into decompensation. because he has his eye on all the vital monitoring parameters. Because if you allow the patient to reach here, that means the patient has gone into class 3 hemorrhage or volume loss and now is decompensating and going into hypotension. By the time you reach here, 30 to 40% blood loss, essentially the patient is condition is irreversible. Cardiogenic shock, the primary problem with the pump, there may be myocardial failure, arrhythmias, tamponade, cardiac contusion, and pump failure, heart failure, which leads to reduction in cardiac output. This cardiac output then leads to decreased myocardial blood supply and in turn leads to myocardial hypoxia, compounding the primary pathology itself. So you have to prevent cardiogenic shock to save the patient. So in cardiogenic shock, what do you look for? You look for signs of heart failure, signs of cardiac tamponade, cardiac dysrhythmia, myocardial infarction. You look at the pulse, there's tachycardia, the pulse may be irregular, giving you an idea about the cardiac arrhythmia. Muffled heart sounds or a third heart sound may be noticed in cardiac tamponade. Engorged neck veins with a hypotension. Usually in hypotension, you would expect the veins to be collapsed. However, engorged neck veins with hypotension you would see in heart failure because the venous return is adequate, but the heart is unable to pump all the blood that is reaching it. Then there is dyspnea because of decreased circulation and decreased tissue oxygenation. The patient is short of breath. And then there is edema in the feet and ankles. In cardiac failure, there is pulmonary edema also leading to dyspnea. And in edema of the feet and ankles, all these point to cardiac failure. Then there are shocks due to low peripheral resistance. Septic shock. This occurs in serious gram-negative bacterial infection like in intestinal obstruction and intestinal gangrene, in intestinal perforation and general peritonitis, or in case of large abscesses secondary to gram-negative bacterial infection. These gram-negative bacteria produce severe and release endotoxins which cause severe endotoxemia. This is classified, the septic shock is classified into a warm septic shock and a cold septic shock. Initially, in septic shock, the patient is warm, hyperdynamic, but in later stages, once the patient is in severe shock, then again hypodynamic and hypovolemic cold septic shock starts. The hyperdynamic or warm septic shock occurs due to release of bacterial endotoxins which activate humoral and cellular components of the immune system. That is the systemic inflammatory response syndrome SIRS, which we have discussed previously. In the hyperdynamic warm stage, there is maldistribution of the blood flow with arteriovenous shunting resulting in tissue hypoxia. The peripheral arterioles and venules and the capillary bed are too much dilated, and when the blood reaches the capillary bed, instead of going through the whole of the capillary bed, the blood gets shunted from the arterioles into the venules directly, and the tissues, because the blood has bypassed the capillary bed, the tissues are left hypoxemic. There is tachycardia, increased heart rate. There is increased cardiac output because there is peripheral dilatation and increased venous return. The skin is warm and dry, and there is lactic acidosis on if you check the electrolytes of the arterial blood gases and the electrolytes. The treatment remains the treatment of the cause because you have to remove the septic focus, otherwise the endotoxemia will continue. The endotoxin bacteria in the pus will continue to produce endotoxins, and you have to drain that pus, and you have to give antibiotics which treat the gram negative bacteria, and maybe the patient will recover. The cold septic shock or the hypodynamic septic shock follows the warm shock if the endotoxemia persists, like the patient presenting late to the hospital, surgery is delayed, the patient goes into severe hypovolemia due to generalized capillary leakage and other fluid leakage. The blood moves out of the intravascular compartment into the extracellular compartment and leading to severe hypovolemia. This leads to reduced cardiac output, tachycardia, and the vasoconstriction. Compensatory vasoconstriction tries to counteract the hypovolemia. The systemic infection, the endotoxemia, endotoxin circulating in the blood, then also cause pulmonary edema and pulmonary hypotension, and lead to swelling of the oxygen blood interface, leading to hypoxia. This then leads to cardiac depression, and the systemic infection and the cardiac depression then combine to reduce the cardiac output further. Patient is cold, clammy, drowsy, and tachynic, and by this time, generally, the patient is in irreversible shock. Fluids may be administered to counter the septic shock, but the fluids generally leak out of the intravascular compartment very quickly, leading to pulmonary and systemic edema, and it becomes very difficult to manage a septic shock once it has reached this stage. Vasovagal shock we have discussed several times in our class. This is due to non-specific causes, vagal nerve hyperactivity, a sudden surprise, mild pain, fear, anxiety, or emotional stress leads to vasodilatation, peripheral vasodilatation, and sudden pooling of blood according to the gravity in the dependent part of the body. And as a result, the blood reaching the heart, the venous return reduces, and the cardiac output decreases. This leads to cerebral hypoxia in an upright patient because the blood has pooled according to the gravity in the lower part of the body, and in a standing up patient or an upright patient, the brain becomes hypoxic, which leads to unconsciousness, and the patient falls to the ground, which itself is the treatment. The treatment is to lay down the patient flat, and if your dental chair permits, Trendelenburg position, head down position, with the feet raised up, would be the treatment of choice. However, if the patient is maintained upright by the attendants, or the patient remains faints but remains upright in the dental chair, and the dentist doesn't immediately lay down the patient flat or put the chair in the Trendelenburg position, then the cerebral hypoxia can lead to permanent brain damage. Anaphylactic shock is caused due to the release of histamine and slow reacting substance of anaphylaxis. This takes place due to antigen antibody reaction taking place in the body, and generally penicillin is the commonest cause of anaphylaxis. Other causes include stings like bee sting or bluefish sting, serum injections like plasma therapy, anesthetics, and shellfish consumption all can lead to anaphylaxis and anaphylactic shock. There is immediate, rapid, massive vasodilatation. There is bronchospasm, edema of the laryngeal mucosa and the pulmonary mucosa, and all of this leads to hypoxia and inability of the blood oxygen gas exchange. Untreated, the mortality is around 10%, and adrenaline is the life-saving drug. If you have an IV access, you can give adrenaline IV, or if you don't have IV access, you can immediately inject into the thigh muscle of the patient, uh, and then go for finding your IV cannula and establishing an IV line. But you have to be quick to save your patient, and the adrenaline is the drug of choice. Neurogenic shock is caused due to traumatic or pharmacological blockade of the sympathetic nervous system. If you remember, there is a sympathetic chain on both sides of the spinal cord. So, in trauma to the spinal cord, or in case of spinal anesthesia, the effects may affect the sympathetic chain, and this too causes massive vasodilatation and peripheral pooling of the blood. The treatment is again Trendelenburg position, give IV fluids and vasopressor drugs, and occasionally you have to give atropine also. Psychogenic shock due to severe pain, fright or flight or bad news. Essentially, it is vasovagal in nature. Then traumatic shock is a combination of several different types of shock. There may be hypovolemia, there may be psychogenic or vasovagal due to pain, and then there may be direct contusion to the heart itself, adding to it by cardiogenic shock. Burn shock, the etiology is hypovolemia. When more than 25% of the body surface area is burnt, there is a generalized capillary leakage, plus the 25% body surface skin that has burnt off. The body is no longer waterproof, and water rapidly evaporates from the body, also from this 25% body surface area or more than that. And this leads to gross hypovolemia in the early stages, in the first 2 days. Uh, by that time, the burns have become infected, and their endotoxemia has also started. So the septic shock then adds to this hypovolemic shock, and the patient's condition usually deteriorates after the third day. In the pathophysiology of shock, the cardiovascular events that take place are low cardiac output, vasoconstriction, tachycardia, myocardial hypoxia, cardiac depression, and pump failure. Any of a combination of these events will take place to give rise to different types of. Then there is reduced glomerular filtration rate and reduced urine output generally in all of the shocks. Uh, Normal urine output we want to maintain at 0.5 to 1 ml per kilogram per hour of the patient body weight. Generally 50 more than 50 ml per hour. But the renin-angiotensin system that is working, the aldosterone release, antidiuretic hormone release, all of these are trying to compensate for the hypotension. As a result, there is reduced GFR and reduced urinary output. So urinary output is generally a good indication of how good your management of shock is going. Then generalized pathophysiological changes that take place due to tissue hypoxemia or tissue hypoxia. There is anaerobic metabolism and lactic acidosis. Sodium is being conserved to retain water in the body. This leads to potassium being released into the blood circulation, elevated serum potassium, and this potassium is then excreted in the urine. So urinary levels of potassium also go up. There is lowered serum calcium, there is platelet aggregation and consumption of platelets, fibrinogen, prothrombin and clotting factors 5 and 8, and this ultimately leads to disseminated intravascular coagulation or a consumption coagulopathy in cases of hemorrhagic shock. As I said earlier, the early stage up to here, the patient is compensating for the blood loss. Although 10% of the blood has been lost, but the patient is compensating by reshifting the fluid from the extracellular compartment into the intravascular compartment. This is a type of an auto transfusion, and that is why the patient is compensating and you don't get hypotension. So this 0 to 10 would be a compensated shock. However, as the bleeding progresses, the patient goes into decompensation and peripheral vasoconstriction takes place to divert the blood to the vital organs, the brain, the heart, the kidneys, liver, from the periphery, and cardiac output has started decreasing. However, the blood pressure is still maintained, but you will notice a rising pulse rate and a falling urinary output. So this stage between 10 to 20%, 22, 23%, this is the stage where the patient is now decompensating. The body's homeostatic mechanisms are no longer able to maintain their homeostasis and the patient is decompensating. This is the stage where the patient is actually treatable and an astute doctor will identify that the patient is going into impending decompensated shock and will treat the patient adequately and reverse the patient and bring him back. Otherwise, if the bleeding continues and the patient reaches 20 to 30 to 40% of blood loss, by that time multiple system or organ damage has been done, and even with treatment death is the result. So this is called irreversible shock. Clinically, the patient will be present with pale, cool, clammy skin in hypotension and hypovolemic shocks. There may be tachycardia or bradycardia depending on whether it is a hypovolemic shock or a neurogenic or vasovagal shock or a septic shock. The pulse is generally not good volume, thin thready pulse. Uh, the systolic blood pressure will generally fall. However, in any type of shock, especially in septic shock, you will see a wide arterial pulse pressure. Pulse pressure is the difference between systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. For somebody who is 120 over 80, the pulse pressure is 40 mm of mercury. For somebody who is 160 over 90, the pulse pressure is 70 millimeters of mercury. But in generally in low peripheral resistance type of shocks, you will see a wide arterial pulse pressure. Then tachypnea, the patient is hypoxic, the tissues are hypoxemic, and and the patient, due to anaerobic metabolism, the patient is going into metabolic acidosis, and to compensate with respiratory alkalosis and to improve the oxygen saturation of the blood, the patient is uh, tachypneic and respiratory rate is increased. Ultimately, the patient becomes drowsy and confused, and you will notice low urine output alongside all of these findings, and the urine will be concentrated urine because the body is trying to conserve body water. The diagnosis of shock generally depends on the history and clinical examination. In cases where you're suspecting hypovolemia, you may give a fast bolus of IV 200 to 500 ml of crystalloids, and if the central venous pressure goes up, then you know that your patient is in hypovolemia. Blood gas analysis and electrolytes will reveal the acid-base balance and the electrolyte imbalance. When you're treating the patient as a whole, you have to rectify all of these things in order to recover the patient. Urine is low output, high osmolarity, low sodium, high potassium urine, and concentrated urine. In traumatic shock, internal and external hemorrhage have to be identified. You have to determine the amount of blood that has been lost. You have to identify how long the casualty has been bleeding. You have to identify if there is any underlying cardiac disorder which may be a part of the trauma or which may be pre-existing before the trauma. Then you have to look at sepsis, trauma to the spinal cord leading to neurogenic shock, and contact with any known allergic substance which may also be contributing to the shock. Concealed hemorrhage in a stab wound to the chest. The bleeding on the outside may not be significant, but inside the whole hemithorax is full of blood, and there is hemothorax. Blood appears white or gray on X-rays. So when you get a patient who you think is going into shock, what do? You immediately check the vital signs and you record those vital signs. Uh, they are the reason that you think your patient is going into shock. Then the next step is to establish an IV access, a wide bore needle, cannula, or even if all the veins are collapsed and you cannot put in a cannula, you can cut down under local anesthesia on a superficial major vein and insert a cannula into that vein under direct vision. You can pass a CVP line to monitor the central venous pressure and insert Foley's catheter into the urethra and the urinary bladder to monitor the urinary output. So, certain parameters that you can use for monitoring of the progress of the shock, whether the patient is recovering or deteriorating. A central venous line will give you central venous pressure monitoring. Pulse oximeter will tell you about the oxygen, arterial oxygen saturation. Blood pressure will tell you about the compensation or the decompensation of shock. ECG will give you information about the myocardium, about the cardiomyopathy, about the myocardial infarction. X-ray chest will give you an enlarged cardiac shadow and cardiac tamponade and cardiac failure. Pulmonary congestion and hemothorax may also be seen. Cardiac output is monitored by echocardiography. Urine output is monitored by Foley's catheter insertion and regular record of urine output. Base deficit and serum lactate levels are monitored through serum electrolyte and blood arterial gases. IV access cannula. Usually you will find questions on this in your talks. Uh, this is the Teflon IV cannula, which is flexible. This is held stiff by this stainless steel needle inside this sheath of Teflon. Here you have a valve opening where there is a needleless connector. Without a needle, you can connect a syringe here and give an injection to the patient. This is the primary opening. You can either put in a stopper here or you can start an IV line here. This metal stillet or metal needle with this part of the chamber is removed once the cannula has been introduced into the vein. So the movements with the movements of the patient, this Teflon can bend, and it is relatively difficult for this to be extruded out of a vein. These are the wings of the cannula. At the time of insertion, you hold these folded up to stabilize the cannula, and after you've inserted the cannula, you can flatten them and use sticking tape to hold the cannula in place. The central venous line, this line is showing the track of the internal jugular vein in this patient with the face turned to the other side. This is mastoid process, sternocleidomastoid, sternal head, clavicular head, and the internal jugular vein passes here. However, if you notice, the external jugular vein is visible in patients with heart failure, despite the fact that the patient is hypotensive. You will see prominent veins, and these sites can be used to put in an IV cannula for IV access. This is a central venous line which has been passed with the Seldinger technique. This is the right shoulder of the patient, chin, jaw, mandible, lower ear, mastoid process, head of the patient. This is the neck of the patient, and here the central venous line has been introduced through the subclavian vein into the right atrium. This is an X-ray of the same patient. You see these leads. This is an ECG electrode sticking to the patient. This is another ECG electrode and the wire, and this is the third wire at the right shoulder. So these three are ECG electrodes, and this line is the CVP line passed into the subclavian vein, then into the superior vena cava, and reaching the right atrium. So this is the CVP line, and this helps you monitor the central venous filling pressure. Foley's catheter, there are two types of Foley's catheter. This is a two-way Foley's catheter, and this is a three-way Foley's catheter. This is the needleless connector. Through this you inject distilled water, which through a very fine cannula reaches the balloon here. Through this needleless connector you are injecting distilled water, which goes through here, and then through a very fine tube reaches this balloon. Once you have inserted the catheter into the urinary bladder, distilled water is injected through this to inflate this balloon, and then this becomes a self-retaining catheter, because this cannot then come out of the urinary bladder through the urethra because of its size. This is the eye of the Foley's catheter. Once all this balloon and this tip is into the urinary bladder, the urine enters the catheter through this eye, goes through the main channel, and then comes out through this part of the catheter, and this part is then connected to a collection bag, a urine bag, and when you maintain record of on the urine output, this is the device that helps you monitor the urinary output on hourly basis. General measures in treatment of shock, the ABC, the airway, breathing, circulation, maintain airway, oxygen therapy. You can give oxygen to the patient to improve the oxygenation and the tissue hypoxemia. The tissue perfusion, especially cardiac perfusion, cerebral, renal, and mesenteric perfusion is important to recover the patient. You can position the patient in Trendelenburg position, either head down or foot up position. That will, in cases where there is hypovolemia or peripheral pooling of blood, that will send blood more towards the vital organs, the brain and the heart. It is important to keep the patient at normal temperature. You must prevent hypothermia, but at the same time you must not warm the patient. Why not? Because if the patient becomes too warm, the peripheral blood vessels will dilate, and again the blood pressure will start falling because of peripheral cooling of blood. Then in such serious patients who are being monitored in an intensive care unit or a high dependency unit, there is a continuous ongoing assessment of the patient. Every few minutes, every 10-15 minutes, somebody will check the cardiac monitor or the urine output or the vital signs or the BP, and maintain an eye on how the patient is progressing. Specific measures for hypovolemic shock: stop the bleeding, stop the fluid loss, whatever the cause. Hypovolemia correction: give fluids or blood transfusion as required, correct the electrolyte balance, correct the acid base imbalance, correct the sepsis, drain the pus or the infective primary focus, give antibiotics which cover these infective organisms. In neurogenic shock, steroids may help. In anaphylactic shock, adrenaline is life-saving. And in cardiogenic shock, inotropic drugs that give strength to the myocardium are required. So, in summary, shock is a life-threatening condition, and early goal-directed therapy and regular monitoring by trained staff will change the outcome. Why? Because you will recognize and counter all the decompensation that is going on. Once you have allowed the patient to decompensate severely, then it becomes very difficult to reverse the shock. As I always say, early detection, you should never rely on the blood pressure. If you remember that graph, the blood pressure is maintained despite the patient going into decompensation. So, your most reliable signs are going to be a rising pulse rate, a falling oxygen saturation on pulse oximeter, and reduction in urinary output. So these will tell you that the patient is decompensating, and whatever treatment or management you are doing, it is not enough and you need to do more. You have to have a high index of suspicion to catch the patients who are going into decompensation, and you must, when you have multiple casualties, you must monitor those patients. You must dedicate more attention to those patients who you are suspecting are likely to decompensate and go into shock. So, simple clinical approach to a patient in shock. Simple revision: stop the continuing loss, ensure hemostasis, replace the volume that has been lost, monitor the patient for decompensation, recognize pre-existing conditions like ischemic heart disease, liver, renal or metabolic disorders, and treat the primary cause of shock. So that concludes our today's lecture, and I hope you understood, and if there are any questions, you can always address your questions to me. Thank you very much. See you next time with your next online lecture on next Wednesday. Thank you.